Good afternoon, everybody. Today we will start a new topic. That is by public sector budgeting and the process, perspective, and approaches. And today's focus area is budget classification, presentation, and programming. So in this course unit, we will uh, have a deep look on a national budget. So we are going to discuss the actual budget of the government of Sri Lanka, very recent budget, and we can understand how the expenditure has been classified, how the government uh, allocate money across several units under different types of expenditure classifications. All such things we will discuss in this unit subject. Let's see perspectives of budgeting. Budget involves not only a time dimension. So people says the budget for the year 2022. So the budget is not reflect on this budget and this for the budget period. So it is not limited to the time dimension, but also different perspective. So that's giving a different picture of the same thing rather than the truly the same thing. People, you may perceive that budget is actually how much government how the amount, the planning of the government to spend to the public in terms of how much government expenditure in government, how much government revenue. So the people says this is the forecasting of income and expenditure for the particular year. So that is one view. So another view we can see that so budget actually is a government policy. Say government, say assume that government has government try to reduce the amount of money allocation, expenditure allocation for a particular sector, for example education. So it means that the government try to deviate from free education to private education. So if government wanted to limit the money expenditure on health sector, then the government plans to motivate the private sector health services. So it's kind of what it gives the budget illustrates, depicts the government policy. And also when we look at the government financing, so the government willing to get more foreign loan into the budgeting. So it means that government still depends on other countries in the loan proportion. Chinese share is much more than other countries. But the government still willing, the government is happy to get more loan from a particular country. So like that. So it gives so many meanings. So it gives a different dimension. A functional perspective, product, including product and perspectives. So budget by nature is institutional perspective. So there are officially legally they have there are three types of perspective. For more detail, please see the page number 48 to 50 in the financial system public service public sector financial management, written by Andres and Birmingham. So if you want, I can upload the textbook. Focus on expenditure classification, that's the most important area. So we'll discuss this. So different budget perspectives as mentioned above result public expenditure classified and analyzed in different dimensions. So now here you can find here the functional perspective. So the functional will mean function of the government. Say education is one function, and healthcare is one function, defense is one function, and social security is one function. So how much government allocate uh, for particular functions. So which are the preferred function, which are least preferred function. So if the government allocate more money for education, it means the government prefer education function. And budget by nature, right, short-term budget, capital expenditure and capital expenditure and recurrent expenditure, like that. An institutional perspective, so how much amount of money has been allocated for universities, how much money allocated for hospitals, how much money allocated for Sri Lanka Telecom, how much allocated for CTB, how much allocated for parliaments, like that. So it's institutional, how much money allocated for a particular institutions. So a budget can be view in these three different views. So this is what is a budget, a perspective of budgeting. And here when dealing with public finance, you will often find and will have to have public expenditure classified, accounted, reported and analyzed in different categories. So when you look at the budget of corporations, companies, you may, for example, here when you look at manufacturing company budget, you can find salary for employees and labor cost and raw material cost, raw material 1, raw material 2, and overhead. Under overhead you can find electricity and utility, telephone and security charges. So there are different types of expenditures, classifications, isn't it? Some expenditures may be admin expenditure, admin cost, sales and distribution cost, and income taxes and finance cost. So there are different types of classification. Likewise, what's the classification method in public sector organizations? So this kind of classification is not appropriate in the public sector accounting. So it's different in non-profit organization. So the ultimate objective of government is to provide better services rather than making profit. So when dealing with public finance, you will often find and will have to have public expenditure classified. So you have to look at how the expenditure has been classified, accounted, how they have recorded in the accounts, reported, how they are report, how do they analyzed the expenditure in different categories. So what is the best way of classifying the public expenditure? Why it is? So it's depend on the purpose, but the classification, right? So it works as a normative framework. So why do we need classification, good classification? So classification expenditure is important. Why? For a policy formulation and measuring the allocation of resources among sectors. For example, in the recent past, the government has allocated very less amount of money for agricultural sector. So it's mean what? So the government wanted to promote organic agriculture, safe food for our citizens. So it's what? The government is not allocated money to import chemical fertilizer. It's what? It's a policy, government policy. You can look at this policy in their budget for policy formulation and measuring the allocation of resources among sector. And in the meanwhile, the government allocate more fund to promote organic fertilizer, and also the government has grant and subsidies for those who are engaging in organic cultivation. For ensuring compliance with legislative authorization, here for some expenditure the government need authorization of the parliament, approval of the parliament, and also when they spend their money there are some hierarchy in where the expenditure has to be certified and approved and recommended for ensuring compliance. So there are the legal amendments, so the legal requirements. So based on that, to comply this kind of legal requirement, the budget expenditure, the expenditure of the government should be classified appropriately. For policy review and performance analysis, the government may propose one policy and allocate money according to that. Later on, the government may measure the policy, whether the government policy is success or not. In the organic agriculture, it's a government policy. So the government will see the performance in a short period, right? Within a short period, the government may understand whether their policy is success or failure. And for day-to-day administration of the budget, so if there is no classification in budget expenditure, how the public money can be managed? If government allocate specifically the amount of money for a particular activity, then it is easy, no? So if government not classified the expenditure very definitely, and it is very difficult to manage. So for example, for salary payment, government has allocated 10 million. Then the accountants in the public sector organization, they may very well understand this 10 million for salary payment and 5 million for capital expenditure, and this 5 million can be utilized only for the capital expenditure. So this 5 million cannot be utilized for paying salary, or this 10 million cannot be utilized to make any purchases or any other expenditure. So in this way, to administrate the budget, the expenditure classification is very important. Purpose. Public expenditures may need to be classified in different ways for different purposes. Appropriation legislation. So now in the parliament, so government draft a budget and submit to the parliament, and the parliament may approve. So for example, this year budget for 2 billion, for example, government expenditure 2 billion, for example. If the finance minister go to the parliament, this year budget is 2 billion, and could you please approve? So is it possible? No. So the Minister of Finance should give the breakdown, how much allocated for particular ministry, how much allocated for particular department, how much allocated for particular type of expenditure for salary, how much for traveling, how much for the capital expenditure. So in this way they have to show the breakup detailed to present the budget in the parliament in effective manner. So this classification is very important. So public expenditure need to be classified in a different ways for different purposes, such as appropriation legislation, for the presentation of budget to the parliament for enactment. So the Minister of Finance present the budget in very detailed manner, and the member of parliaments may comment on that. Second, administration, budget administration and accounting. For the administration of budget implementation, the budgetary accounting. So they have to record how much money has been allocated for salary and wage, how much allocated for capital expenditure, how much allocated for traveling, right? So this kind of expenditure, any classification of expenditure should be important. It's very important to administrate the budget, and also to account. They have to record the transactions, the allocation in their books. Policy making and review. Here, for the presentation of reports that match the need of report users, policy decision makers, and general public, and budget managers. So policy here, for example, government is not allocated money to import milk powder, and government not allocated money for import vehicles. It's been what the government policy is to restrict some kind of imports, and the government wanted to save some foreign reserves. And international comparison. So if the government keep the detailed classification records, they can compare with other countries' budget expenditure. Categories. So what are the categories of expenditure in the budget? Public expenditures are generally classified according to the following categories. Functions. Historical analysis and policy analysis. Here historical analysis means what the last year, 2020, 2021, 2022, so how much allocated for each year. For example, here the amount of money allocated for motor vehicle imports. 2020 how much, 21 how much, 22 how much. So historical analysis and policy analysis. So earlier in 2020, government may allocate 100 million, for example. In 2021, say 50 million, and 2020 1 million, for example. It means what? So based on this analysis, we can find that the government policy is to make restriction on motor vehicle imports. And organization. For accountability and administrating the budget. So organize. Here first the money will be allocated for the ministry, and ministry will allocate money to its different departments under the ministry, and under the department there are several units. Planning unit, right? Planning unit, and implementation unit, and administrating unit, research and development units. So for this kind of functions, so for this kind of organizing, so the budget categories is very important. Funding. So how much allocate to particular department A, B, C, and where the money is coming from. So whether it is foreign money or treasury money, or the self-generated money. So whatsoever the way of income for the funding for administrating and budgeting. Economic categories. Statistical reporting and aggregate fiscal control. You may see there are a lot of figures in the annual report, and you can find how much government allocated for sales and wages, how much allocated for pension, how much for interest payment, how much for loan repayment. So this is what. So last year for a 40%, so this year 41%. So there's a comparison, no? So this is what the economic categories. And line items or object for compliance, control, and internal management. Here 20 million allocated for salary, and 10 million allocated for traveling cost. And this is what, if 20 million allocated for salary, the maximum limit a particular institution can spend is limited to 20 million, and 10 million means a particular department or institution spend limit is limited to 10 million, so they can't go above this figure. So this kind of what compliance and control. And program, here for policy formulation and performance accountability. So for example, program Mahavari development project and Port City Colombo project programs. So it's this kind of different program. So based on, so there are a lot of classifications, categories. Here expenditure classification, so based on the functions. United Nations classification of function, classification of function of the government. So I will correct it, right? I will check it. So how? So defense is one function, health is one function, education is one function. Here for historical analysis and policy analysis is the purpose. And organization, so how much the government is allocated money for a particular ministry. Where here Ministry of Health, under the Ministry of Health there are so many departments, and so many departments, under each and every department there are some hospitals and there are a number of units. A Ministry of Defense is one organization. So for why? So why? What's the purpose? For accountability and administrating the budget. Fund, so where are the fund coming from? So it's exempt from considered fund, loan, or grant. So it's coming from World Bank fund, or that's coming from Treasury fund, or some donation, for example Red Cross, European Union, like that. For what purpose? Is for administrating the budget. Economic categories. So GFS, Government Finance Statistics, GFS, economic categories. So compensation of employees, subsidies, grant, interest payment. So this is what. So when you look at the annual report, you can find the information under the common headings. So this common heading include what? Compensation. Employees mean what? Salary, subsidies, for example, for the people who subsidies for farmers and entrepreneurs, like that. Interest rate for small business enterprises, like interest payment. So how much government paid as interest cost, how much government spent as grant, like that. For what's the purpose? For the statistical reporting and aggregate fiscal control. Line items or objects. So personal expenditure, travel, maintenance, etc. For the purpose, for compliance, control, and internal control. Keep it there. And here line item, here I can find here the personal expenditure, travel and maintenance. So the purpose is what? So how much money allocated for travel, maintenance, salary, like that. For what the purpose? For compliance, control, and internal management. Here program, the development activities and operational activities. There are two types of program. So development activities and operational activities we will discuss in detail. Well, so for policy formulation and performance accountability. Functional categories, we look at functional categories. uh, classification of expenditure. I check it right. Correct form. Here COFOG, it means classification of function of government, right? I wrongly spelled earlier. So COFOG means classification of function of government. Here classification of expenditure, classification of function of government. Classification of function of government recommends the functions to be reported in 10 divisions. Yeah, so here what do you mean by this one? This is recommended by UN, United Nations. So it categorizes 10 functions. It recommend. So the United Nations recommend the governments to categorize into 10 functions. The first function is general public services. General public services, like the administration in the educational secretariat. So they are issuing certificate, and they are issuing birth certificate, and keeping demographic data, and so the normal public services, right? Normal routine public services, general public services, and defense, military, army, like that, and public order and safety. It's done by the police commission and human rights commission, like that. And economic affairs, here banking activity, interest banking activities, and central bank, and country's financial system, capital market, like that. Environmental protection, forest department, coastal area, environmental authority, like that. Housing and community amenities, health services, recreation, culture, religion, education, and social protection. So these are the 10 functions classified by United Nations. It's called what? Classification of function of government. Economic categories is earlier. Here these are the functional categories. Now we look at economic categories. An economic classification of expenditure is required for analyzing. An economic classification of expenditure is required for analyzing the budget and defining the macro physical position. For example, the share of wages in government expenditure and the value of transfer to public enterprises are important measure of impact of public policy. When you look at the annual report, you can find different portions, wage and salary, pension, interest rate, so like that. This kind of information you can find. So they have categorized the expenditure for what? To measure the financial performance in terms of government fiscal policy, government monetary policy, like that. Here you can find economic categories under the government finance statistics. In section 1, economic classification of government expenditure. You can find the compensation of employees. When you look at the government finance statistic, you can find these 8 different categories of expenditure. The compensation of employees, use of goods and services, consumption of fixed capital, interest rate, subsidies granted, grants received or paid, and social benefits and other expenditures. Please read Government Finance Statistic 2001 for more detail of each of the above economic classification. So earlier, this is what functional categories. So it's based on what here functional categories. There are 10, and economic categories there are 8. Now we look at the Sri Lankan budget. You can find the Sri Lankan budget here. So in the government budget, so I didn't see. You can find it. Okay, you can find the budget, right? So in the budget you can find all these kind of classifications. So this is this classification is according to the United Nations classification function of government, but actually you couldn't find this kind of classification in our country. Some of it's a little bit different. And also here this is what economic categories. So this is based on the government finance statistics requirement required by IMF, right? But here now we are looking into the actual budget of Sri Lanka, right? So there are different categories. Here, so mainly there are 3: general services, special law, and advanced account activities. So we look at these 3, right? So we have in our budget we have general services, special law services, and advanced account activities. So these are the main 3 parts of our budget. Again, these 3 major categories are classified further into programs. So expenditure heading, and each expenditure heading again divided into two, each programs, and programs are divided by a project. There are a number of projects, and there are sub projects, and even it's categorized under object category, recurrent expenditure, capital expenditure, and each recurrent expenditure can be divided into items up to n number of items and source of funding. So this is how our Sri Lankan budget has been classified. I will show you the actual budget of the country. Right, this is the budget. This is budget estimate 2022. Here you can find special spending units heading, right, head number up to 1 to 25. You can find how much money allocated for each ministries. Here first schedule, second schedule, third schedule. Here you can find here first schedule belongs to general services, second schedule for special law services, third schedule for appropriation act. This is for what advanced account activities. Here first schedule indicate the general services for how much for this one, million, billion, trillion, 2.796 trillion allocated for general services. And second schedule here 2.6 trillion, and for third schedule 6 billion, right? You can find further information. These are revenue estimates. We have to focus on expenditure estimates. See, how government has classified the expenditure. Okay, this is the expenditure category. Recurrent expenditure. Under recurrent expenditure, personal emolument. It includes what? Salaries and wages, overtime, holiday payments, other allowances. Under the traveling expenditure, domestic traveling, foreign traveling, supplies, stationery and office requisite, fuel, diet and uniforms, medical supplies and others. Maintenance and expenditure. So vehicle maintenance, plant and machinery maintenance, building and structure services. Here transport, postal, electricity. Here transfers and interest payment and discount. And under the capital expenditure, rehabilitation and improvement of capital assets. Under that, building and structures, plant, machinery, equipment, vehicle. Let's say the capital acquisition, purchase of capital assets. Here these are the classification. And here when you look at here government expenditure, you can find here how much allocated for His Excellency President this year 2020. This amount has allocated for the President in 1000 rupees, right? There are 30 here, 30, right? this amount 2022 2.3 million, right? So likewise we can find our here, you know what, a special spending unit. There are 25 up to 25 special spending units. So from 101 here, now it's end to 20, up to 25. Ministry, instead of ministry, start from serial number 101. Here this is the summary, right? This is how we are going to discuss. In the next class we will start in detail. So meanwhile, I kindly request you to have a copy of soft copy of the budget speech, budget document with you. So in the future you have to make a presentation on that, right? So now we will wind up the class, and tomorrow I will inform the time tomorrow, otherwise we will meet on Friday. If we have classes tomorrow, we will I will inform you, right?